What will you find at the Waltham Museum? For over 50 years, this volunteer-run, nonprofit museum has been a valuable community resource, preserving and showcasing our history of innovation and manufacturing through the artifacts of daily life and pastimes enjoyed. Discover the people who built our city and the lives they lived. Help preserve and share the stories of your family and neighbors. Whether a visitor, volunteer, or friend, you are welcome at the Waltham Museum.
Welcome. Welcome to the Waltham Museum Farm Talk, originally done October 19th, 2024. In 1630, Watertown was one of the three communities in Massachusetts, the first inland settlement of the Commonwealth. In January 1631, John Winthrop, pictured here, led a small group of men down the river to explore new territories. He named some of the natural features that are still in existence today. Beaver Brook, which we're all familiar with, Masters Brook, and Mount Feake as he traveled down the river. Waltham was originally a part of Watertown. It was considered part of the Western lands, which included Weston, Lincoln, and Sudbury. The first man to claim ownership was a trader named John Oldman. He purchased a large claim, pictured here, from the King of England. And this is John Oldman. The area included Mount Feake Cemetery along the Charles River, almost to Main Street and Brandeis University. So it was a pretty big area. In 1636, the land was divided into lots. The lots were determined by how much of a herd you had. So there was between 20 and 100 acres for each lot, again, determining how much herd you had. The first settler in Waltham was believed to be Ed Garfield. He lived on Warren Street in Hager Lane, pictured right here. And he was related to President Garfield, so ancestor of President Garfield. Roads were determined by the herds of cattle that grazed the land. There were four main herds in Waltham in 1669. The mill herd grazed between Beaver Brook and Prospect Hill. The White Horse Path which is now Winter Street. The town herd crossed Beaver Brook, Prospect Hill, and the Great South Pond. Another herd followed the Sudbury Path, which is now Main Street. Waltham is located 10 miles west of Boston with access to the Charles River, which made it a great place for the Boston markets for agriculture and industry. This is a topiary map that is available at the library. That's beautiful. That kind of shows the Waltham and what the land was originally like. The initial fertile plain was along the Charles River, and it went about a mile out in either direction. That was the most fertile land in Waltham. Most of the land in Waltham was covered with a loomy soil and that was studded with rocks, and it was only moderately fertile. Waltham was incorporated into a town in 1738. The Arrigo Farm, which is now what is now the Arrigo Farm, was 16 acres, originally purchased by John Warren. It dates back to 1635 and could be even longer than 1635, older, but there are no records before that. The first farmhouse was built in 1650 by the Warren family, who continued to live in the house until Grace Warren married Samuel Barnes in 1781, and then it became the Barnes House. In 1837, the Barnes House was torn down, but a part of it still remains, so the center part. In 1885, it was rented to a dairyman, James Banks, who lived there until 1922. In 1918, Placido Arrigo, an Italian immigrant, worked on the estate. In 1923, he purchased the land and lived on it until his death in 1922. His family, John Arrigo, then was the owner of the house, and he died in 2011. The Arrigo family also owned part of a farm on Mount Wally Road. The farm has been bought by the city, and if you drive by on Warren Street, you'll see how beautifully it's been renovated. It is still used as a tree farm, so it is honored as the first farm in Waltham and also the last. Waltham had several newspapers. The Waltham Sentinel, which was a newspaper in Waltham, a weekly newspaper from 1856 to 1877. And newspapers were really important. It was dedicated to local intelligence, agriculture, manufacturing, literature, and advertising. So it impressed me that agriculture was right there at the top because it was a very important thing in the city or in the town at that time. In 1863, one of their articles, and the articles on agriculture were always on the front page, were interesting to me. This one was an article related to dairy, and it debated the benefits of keeping a cow in the barn in the winter. The barn should be well ventilated, and when you limit the cow to the barn, you make more milk, but not of good quality. And that was in May of 1863. In May of 1865, an article stated, the quality of the cow manure will predict the yield of the farm. When a farmer commences to raise milk, the manure heap increases, thus producing more hay. The question about manure always still is a farmer question, always in debate of how you get your vegetables, etc., how good your vegetables are. In 1865, during the rebellion, i.e. the Civil War, the tiller of the soil should receive adequate, full, and fair compensation. The writer says, the prices, though they may be doubled, more as it passes through more hands. So they were trying to get better wages for farmers, which is something that people still struggle with today. The Farmers Club, and we have the Waltham Library has a complete record of all the Farmers Club's minutes, but we do have a few here of their official program. It was a weekly club it met from 1857 to 1890 to discuss agriculture and technology. Members were farmers and businessmen who owned farms in Waltham. Those businessmen had other men farm for them, but it was a prestigious club in the city. They had a festival yearly on Rumford Ave, behind what is now the City Hall. It had hot turkey supper catered with orchestra and dancing. The members could display their produce. The governor and other distinguished guests would attend. They had a country fair that was held. It was held near Hubby Hall, again across from City Hall. Cattles were penned at the time. Displays of fruit and vegetables. Homemade articles were made by the citizens and displayed and sold. There were boat races on the Charles and pig races. When you look at the schedule of the city census, agriculture was listed as 110 farm properties in 1850 and 109 in 1880. Homestead supported families for 150 to 200 years in some instances. The same families homed the farms. Only 1/5 of the farms exceeded 100 acres. 2/5 were values as land building equipment, combined $10,000 or more. So the combination of the equipment combined $10,000 or more. Interesting that 9 Catholics were listed as farmers in 1880. Farming, as a form of self-employment, continued to attract men despite the urban character of the city. So even as it changed, people were still drawn to Waltham for farming and agriculture. Well into the 20th century, much of the land was taken up by widely dispersed farms. So along with its growth as a city and a manufacturing center, Waltham continued to incorporate freehold farming. So we'd like to welcome you to hear some of the stories of Waltham farmers.
Tortola, born in 1884, arrived at Ellis Island alone in 1903 at the young age of 18 with only $12 in his pocket. He had made this fateful journey to chase the American dream like millions of others after being born into poverty in Miranda, Italy. His plan was to send money to his single mother and 5 siblings. Miranda was and is a medieval and stunning farming village clinging to a cliff on the side of the mountain about 70 miles north of Naples. Since there was very little money and no future for him there, he bravely made his way to Boston. He was sponsored by a friend, a paisano from Miranda. Raphael lived in a crowded boarding house in Boston and worked as a farm laborer in Belmont. But a year later, he was drafted by the Italian army, and after serving his country, Raphael was given an honorable discharge and returned to Miranda in 1906. In March '07, he married his childhood friend, Angela D'Agostino, born in 1883 in Miranda. 2 months later, he left again for America without Angela, who was needed to help support her family. Finally, 2 long years later, in 1909, she arrived in Boston to begin her new life with Raphael. They both worked at the 20-acre Chenery Lockhart estate in Belmont. There were very prosperous large vegetable farms and many greenhouses where Raphael eventually was promoted to foreman. He made many trips with the horse and wagon full of produce to Boston markets. And during the years living in small houses on the Belmont property, Angela gave birth to 5 children, tragically losing Anna at 20 months in 1916. My father was born several months later. In 1920, after saving their wages for 11 years, Angela and Raphael purchased a 3.5 acre farm with a barn and farmhouse from the Paino family on the corner of Forest and Harrington Road, Forest Street and Harrington Road. They were narrow dirt roads back then, and when the family moved from Belmont to Forest Street, my father was 5 years old with 3 older sisters, Anne, Sue, and Dorothy. My grandparents and the 4 children packed up the horse and wagon with all of their belongings and made the 2-mile trip to Waltham. My father said it was like moving to the country. Neighborhood farms were owned by the Rickeys, the Bikiris, the Lynches, Delapines, Solmonettis. Steve Rando's farm was located right next door to the Tortolas. He was my mother's second cousin. On the other side of Waltham were the farms owned by the Rando, Griggs, Viles, Kennedy, Casella, and Pizzi families. On the Tortola farm, there was no running water. An outhouse stood near the main house. They accessed a well water pump located on the farm, and for heat they used a wood-burning stove. Life was very difficult with long back-breaking days of grueling work. My grandmother was not happy, and it took her a few years to become accustomed to this new life. The children worked on the farm before and after school. A Model T wooden jitney bus took them and other neighborhood students to the historic Pond End School near Taunton Pond Road, about 2 miles away. In snowy weather, a horse and sleigh replaced the bus. Throughout the following decades, their farm would produce tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, celery, beets, pole beans, radishes, endives, spinach, escarole, romaine, corn, and more. For help on the farm, neighborhood kids and young adults were hired. My grandmother took pride in her flower gardens, which included gorgeous zinnias and asters, among others. She had peony bushes encircling the lawn, which were her favorites, and one year, at the Boston Flower Show, she won a prize for her beautiful asters. Aww. Like other farmers, the Tortolas lived off the land. Angela was an excellent cook and made good use of the abundance of vegetables. We all still remember the wonderful aromas emanating from her kitchen. In the 1920s and 30s, as my father and his sisters got older, they took turns daily driving truckloads of produce to Haymarket Square and other locations in Boston and surrounding towns from May through November. Also, bartering was common. In the early years, a horse and plow was used until enough funds were saved to purchase a tractor. Some of their farm animals provided food. They had rabbits, chickens, goats, and pigs. Cats and dogs were also around for pest control and companionship. Needless to say, the Tortolas preserved many fruits, vegetables, and meats in jars for the winter, and a root cellar was also used throughout the cold months. Christmas dinner consisted of pasta, calamari, bacala, eels, smelts, and other fish. They celebrated this Italian tradition called the Feast of the Seven Fishes. With high honors, my father and all three sisters graduated from Waltham High School. In those days, finishing high school was unusual because most farming families needed their children to leave school in order to work on the farms. Every Sunday, year-round, the family attended Mass together, enjoyed a big pasta dinner, and then visited friends and family traveling by horse and wagon. During the Great Depression, around 1930, my grandparents lost the little money they had saved in the bank. But with luck, they were able to hold on to the farm, unlike many others during those difficult years. Ultimately, the Tortola farm was successful and provided a comfortable and humble life for them all. My brother, cousins, and I have such fond memories of our grandparents, who we called Nani and Taton. We visited often and occasionally helped on the farm. During World War II, farmers like the Tortolas were asked to sell and sometimes donate their fruits and vegetables to support the troops both at home and abroad. My father was not drafted because farmers were needed at home to produce the food for the war effort. By 1939, all four of the Tortola children had married and started families of their own, and therefore worked less and less on the family farm. Eventually, it would become difficult to maintain the farm. And sadly, in 1957, our sweet and beautiful grandmother passed away, and 6 years later, our warm and wonderful grandfather left us. This was the end of a 40-plus year era of the Tortola farm. In the mid-70s, the property was subdivided into house lots. In 1978, Peter and I were fortunate enough to build our house on one of the lots and raise 3 children of our own. Still living there after 46 years, I am proud to be the caretaker of our incredible family history. Rooted to this sacred land, I'm reminded daily of special memories when I look out the window and see the large, more than 100-year-old green Anjou pear tree in my backyard. My father had told us that they had sat and ate lunch under the tree, shade of the tree, while taking a rest from their farm work. I wrote a self-published book about my grandparents' journey. In an epilogue, I said, Angela and Raphael were good parents, community members, and loyal U.S. citizens. And speaking to my cousins in the epilogue, I said, it's important to note that our parents and their spouses were exceptional people who learned their lessons well from Angela and Raphael and passed them on to their children. We will always remember our strong role models, my parents, Katie and Fred Tortola, Auntie Ann and Uncle Al Pizzi, Auntie Sue and Uncle Joe Petrino. Also, Auntie Dot and Uncle Del Apollonio held on to the original farmhouse for years to sell their prolific and gorgeous greenhouse geraniums. My parents and my aunts and uncles personified the greatest generation. Now in the next millennium, 120 years after those 2 momentous voyages to America, a 5th generation is learning the important life lessons of Nani and Taton, a couple with great integrity, strength, dignity, and pride. They left a legacy of love, the value of hard work, and respect for others. Thanks for listening. So my parents were Fred and Kay Tortola, and after their honeymoon in 1939, Fred and Katie lived in the Tortola farmhouse with his parents until they bought their own 5-acre farm from the Lynch family around 1946. It was located just a couple of blocks away in what is now the Alderwood Road and Shade Street neighborhood on the corner of Forest Street and Trapella Road. My brother Fred Jr. was 4 years old, and my father said that his mother, Nani, ranted after they moved, even though it was only 2 blocks away. She was extremely upset and very attached to my brother. And soon after they moved, little Edith was born in 1946. On the farm, there were 7 rows of apple trees and a total of 75 peach trees. For the first 2 years, my parents cultivated the orchards and stored the fruit in their cellar, keeping it cool with 6 300-pound blocks of ice. They made many trips into Boston markets to sell the fruit. However, there wasn't enough demand for peaches and apples, so they cleared the farm and planted many varieties of vegetables, keeping only a couple of rows of apple trees. Farm hands were mostly neighborhood kids, all good workers who were paid 35 cents an hour. My father told us how hard he and my mother worked 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. I remember my father telling me he stayed up many nights to rotate the sprinklers by hand until one summer he installed irrigation pipes every 40 feet. Even little Fred Jr. loved helping out on the farm as he got older. Tragically, in December of 1949, beautiful Edith, at the age of 3, died suddenly from appendicitis while they were on vacation. And my mother was so distraught that she was unable to live in their farmhouse, so they moved in with her parents, Philip and Katerina Rando. My parents sold the farm to a developer, and with my mother's family, they invested in the beginnings of the Wallace Recreation Center. I was born soon after, and a new life began for us. My father labored there around the clock, and my mother worked part-time. My parents never lost the work ethic they learned on the farms and taught their children and grandchildren by being such good role models. They were truly the greatest generation. So the story of my mother's parents is very different, but it's just as interesting and as special as the Tortolas. My grandparents were Katerina and Filippo Rando, Nani and Nono. They were born in 1894 and 1890 on a stunning speck of an island called Filicudi. Filicudi is one of 7 Aeolian islands just off the northern coast of Sicily, north of Messina. And some of you may have heard of the island of Filicudi because many from there emigrated to Waltham in the early 1900s in search of the American dream. Families in Filicudi lived off the land and farmed the ancient terraces. They fished for sustenance too. Very little money was used. So to make a better life for his family, Filippo's father, Giovanni, traveled to French Algiers in North Africa to work on huge pig and vegetable farms. When my grandfather and his brother Stefano were only 7 and 8 years old, they were sent to live and work with their father. Filippo's mother, Rosa, and 2 young sisters stayed in Filicudi, but a few years later they traveled to be together as a family. 2 months before his 19th birthday in 1909, Filippo boldly boarded and worked on a freighter headed for Ellis Island. He had $20 in his pocket when he arrived. After making his way to Waltham to live with Paisani, he found a job as a weaver in the cotton mill on Moody Street. He told us he worked 60 hours a week for $3, but after 6 months, he received a raise of $6.50 a week because he spoke fluent French, which he had learned growing up in Algiers. The foreman valued his ability to translate for the many French-Canadian workers at the mill. For the rest of his life, Filippo was known as U Francese and also as Philip. Caterina Defina, his future wife, also worked at the mill, which is how they met. After getting married in 1912 in Boston, my grandparents began raising a family of 5 children while moving around to various houses and apartments in downtown Waltham. Sadly, they lost their second child, Bartolo, in 1917 at the age of 3. In 1915, my grandfather had been stricken with typhoid fever, which had put him in the hospital. Because he was sickly in the following years, the doctors told him to move to the country where the air was cleaner. So in 1921, my grandparents purchased a house and farm from the Salvuccis in North Waltham. The address was 7 Mount Wally Road at the very top of College Farm Road, which is off of Lexington Street. In the early years, the Randos used a horse and plow until they could afford a tractor. They produced a huge variety of vegetables: celery, tomatoes, beets, pole beans, radishes, zucchini, peppers, spinach, endives, romaine, corn, and more. Chickens were raised to eat and also to sell, along with the eggs. They also raised rabbits to eat and sell. And dogs and cats were always around to hunt for mice and rats. In the 20s and 30s, the family took turns making daily trips to Boston, Charlestown, and surrounding cities to sell and barter. Like the Tortola family, Philip, Katerina, and their 5 children worked hard, long hours on the farm. My mother remembered working very early on school mornings and then changing quickly into school clothes. After school, she changed back into her work clothes to resume her work in the many rows of vegetables. The family preserved foods for the winter in many dozens of jars. There was no running water at first, and they used a well water pump located halfway down the farm. My grandfather hired someone to dig a long trench up to the house from the well, and he paid the man with a bottle of homemade wine at the end of each day. An outhouse stood next to the farmhouse, and telephone pages were used for toilet paper. But when visitors came, the telephone pages were replaced with softer tissue wrappings from citrus fruits the family had bought. A wood-burning stove was used for cooking and keeping the house warm. My mother remembered collecting wood and sticks from the woods nearby, and coal was eventually used. Like the Tortolas, the Rando children attended the Pond End School, riding in a horse and wagon or a sleigh in the winter. In order to become more Americanized, my mother's name was changed. It was the same as her mother's, and was changed from Katerina with a C to Catherine with a K. She and her siblings spoke very little English when they first started school. And my mother, who had a heart condition, was the only one of the 5 siblings to graduate high school because the others were told to quit school and help out on the farm. My aunt Chris Russo got her GED later in life and also attended college. John was the oldest, and his wife was Dorothy Thompson, followed by my Aunt Rose. Her husband was Tom Capadona. My mother and father, Marion married George Rando, and Chris was the youngest. Her husband was Joe Russo. The farm was not large enough to sustain a good living for this family, so they needed to rent small pieces of farmland elsewhere. These included areas of the Lexington Street YMCA, Kennedy Middle School, Wyman Street along Route 128, and Forest Street, where the Girl Scout camp is located today. In the early days, during the Christmas season, stockings were hung and filled with walnuts, oranges, tangerines, and chestnuts. There was little money for gifts. Instead, they prepared a big feast, which they enjoyed with friends and relatives. Just like in many Italian families, they prepared the Feast of the 7 Fishes. After the 1929 stock market crash and through the Great Depression, my grandparents were able to hold on to their farm. While many families and businesses were unable to withdraw their hard-earned savings from banks, Philip and Katerina were not affected because they kept all of their cash hidden in their cellar. In '43, my grandparents sold their Mount Wally property and purchased the Hardy Estate on Lexington Street, where there was a large house accompanied by a barn and several acres of farmland. It was on the east side of the street where the Chesterbrook Garden Apartments stand today. In 1946, my grandparents, with John, their son, and my aunt and uncle, Marion and George Rando, purchased a large empty lot on the corner of Lake Street and Lexington Street. They built the first 20 bowling lanes, which later became 60 lanes. And in 1950, my father and other brothers-in-law invested in the business to build the roller skating rink, and this was the beginning of the Locks Recreation Center. In 1950, by eminent domain, the government acquired and developed the Hardy Estate land where the Randos were living because the large numbers of veterans returning from the war needed places to live with their families. So the Hardy house was moved to Lake Street. And since they had to move, Philip and Katerina built a brick house on Lexington Street in 1949 where Burger King stands today. Around 1952, to accompany the bowling and roller skating business, the family decided to build a dairy bar and restaurant where the brick house stood. So it needed to be moved, which was quite an undertaking. Hydraulic jacks, huge beams, and rollers were used, and the house was very slowly and successfully moved a block away up to the top of Nutting Road, where 72 years later it is still there with new owners, and whenever I smell fresh basil and tomatoes, I'm transported to Nona's little garden there on Nutting Road. My grandparents came from such a different world, from enduring early difficult lives on a small remote island to running prosperous farms and being part of the Wallach success. Tragically, my beautiful and doting Nani died suddenly in a car accident in 1967 at the age of 73. My amazing grandfather lived a full life of 95 years and passed away in 1986. Just like Raphael and Angela Tortola, Philip and Katerina Rando were solid community members and citizens. They raised their big families to work hard and respect others, leaving us with a rich legacy of love of family and tradition. Their invaluable life lessons were passed on through the family to the 5th generation today. And thanks for listening.
Our next speaker is Ed Kennedy. He's representing his family's farm, Kennedy Pig Farm, which was across the street from the reservoir. So our fathers worked together. My father
Mary's father and my father were like brothers.
Right. Yes, and Ed worked with my brother as well.
We were like brothers.
That's right. So thank you, Ed.
Well, first of all, this is great. That's a tough act to follow. I think it's, as I get older and meet people of my age, I notice we all like to talk about what we did or what our family did or whatever. So the fact that I get a crowd like this is terrific. I'll start off by saying our farm was my grandfather started it. He came over in the second part of the 1800s and bought land on the Lincoln-Waltham line. He couldn't read or write, so he signed his name with an X. And he ran that farm for a number of years until the city of Cambridge put a bill in the legislature that they needed a reservoir. So the state came up, or Cambridge, I don't know the details, the government took the biggest part of his farm away for the building of the reservoir. They left him with 20 to 30 acres up on the side hill that they didn't need, actually was at a higher grade. And there, he, with the money that he got from the land, which I believe was around $17,000 at the time, which was a lot of money, he built a new house and a barn, and he became more or less of a gentleman father with some cows, and he raised some small crops, and got by very well. He died when my father was 5. Consequently, my father and his 3 other siblings lived with my grandmother on the farm up until my father turned around 16. At that time, my grandmother died, his mother died. The family was in flux. It was right after the stock market crash. Things were not good. His brother, my uncle, ended up on a farm up in New Hampshire. My father ended up in an apartment down here in Waltham, working at the Waltham watch factory. And he was, I was 17 or so at the time. He had the job. He felt pretty good, and he got promoted. He wanted to work like most people in that day did. And they were building a speedometer things for the Ford Motor Company. It was a contract that the Waltham Watch Factory had. He was involved in it. Long story short, the contract, they fulfilled the contract, and they laid him off. He walked out of there and said to himself, I will never work for anyone again. He ended up getting back with his brother. They first started cutting wood off the farm to make money. Then they got into the oil business down here in Waltham. We still have a sign at, I think, my son's house that says Kennedy Oil. They would deliver and measure the oil in 5-gallon cans. So if you brought 10 cans, that was 50 gallons. That was their first year, and then they made a few bucks. They got a truck with a register and a pump, so they were moving ahead. They ran that business for 8 or 10 years, but they always wanted to get back to the farm. And what they did is they saved their money. There was other members of the family that owned the land, and they ended up buying them out. And in the late 30s, they wanted to get into pig business. And they were great friends with the Casellas, which were right down the street. And Casellas had already been well established in the pig business. And by the way, the reason why these areas, there's a couple of reasons why areas got into raising more pigs. There was things about, and most of them were economic, there were things about pigs that other things you raised on the farm didn't have. And I can remember one fellow telling me, well, you know, I go with my truckload of crops down to the market, and they sense that I'm not getting them sold. They know I can't go back with them because they're gonna rot, he said. So then they take advantage of that. He said, with pigs, I go down to the market with pigs. If you don't want to give me what I want to get, the hell with you. I'm taking my pigs and going back home. So, getting back to my father and my uncle, they ended up getting a few pigs. They built some brood houses for the sows to raise the young ones. The thing around here, in this part of the country, and in some other parts of the country, is in order to raise livestock, you gotta have feed. That is it. And around here, and the reason why towns like Waltham, Woburn, you could go the whole string of 128, the reason why a lot of pigs were raised out in that area in the day is because it was outside of a metropolitan area. We didn't have great farmland. It was good for smaller crops and whatnot, but we weren't out in the Midwest where we could raise, we had 1,000 acres where you can grow corn and soybean and you feed your pigs. You wouldn't even think of feeding them garbage. And back then, most towns, and I say that the farmers were the original recyclers, most towns had two collections. You had the trash collection, and you had what we call garbage, but being politically correct, I'd say the food scraps today. And there was, every town had those collections, and farmers that were like the Casellas and numerous other ones realized that, you know, if we raise more pigs, we can go out, we can pick up a town, they'll pay us to pick up the garbage, we bring the garbage back to the pigs, we feed the pigs, you know, we're doing good. So that was another economic reason. You know, there was different ways to make money with it. So over the years, they got started, like I said, in the late 30s. Over the years, we got, I'll say food scraps now. We've got food scraps from numerous places. The city of Boston, Watertown, Arlington, Waltham dumped their food scraps up at our farm for a number of years until most of these cities and towns decided that it wasn't feasible to send 2 trucks around because it was too costly, and they combined the food scraps in with the trash, and now it's all what it is. What gets me is, fast forward to more recent years, you see trucks going around picking up plastic bottles, glass, and there was no problem now, but back then they didn't want to do it. And that's fine. It's the way we evolved. But we kept pigs. I believe we were the last ones to raise pigs commercially in Waltham. We ended up, the folks ended up selling the farm in 1983, and it's now the Bay Colony Office Park. But during the heyday, the pig farm, and like I said, a lot of the farmers that were raising other crops, because of the economics, they went more to pigs. I know Casella was one, they raised crops at the beginning, but we had it at its top, it was probably 3,000 pigs raised up there. Wow. And like a lot of the farms around, and I could name a few names. There was Cavuto, Griggs, Silva, Casella, us. I don't have the name of all of the farms, but my father used to say there was actually 12 farms that raised a number of pigs, you know, into the several hundreds or into the thousands. And back then, again, as the industry started to die, we had places, and we used to bring the hogs to some little packer when I was a kid. But as the industry shriveled up and the industry evolved into what it is today, this area was not the place for it. One being, you can build a strong fence and keep your animals on your side of the property line, but you can't build a fence for odor. and as Waltham got more and more developed, that became a bigger problem. So I will make one note: the way the industry's evolved, it's moved down south, and I visited pig farms. Personally, I ended up moving. We had another farm in Westford. I raised pigs up there up until around 2000. But I've visited farms down south, and it has really become a science. I mean, the pork you buy today in the grocery store is head and shoulders better than what you would get back in that era. One sad note, personally, I think, is the largest pork producer and hog farmer in this hog farming company in this country is called Smithfield Packing. They raise a huge percentage of their own hogs, and they're the largest producer of pork in the country. And sadly, it's owned by the Chinese. So they came over here. They copied our technology, and because China is such a huge country in consuming pork, they copied a lot of they bought our companies and then copied a lot, and a lot of the technology of how they raise hogs today is now done in China. So with that, thank you for.
My name is Rick Pizzi. My grandparents were Dominic and Angela Pizzi, and similar to everybody else's story, they originally were renting land approximately where the guest quarters Marriott is on Wyman and Winter Streets. And they found another piece of property that was available on Lincoln Street that someone had borrowed money from Mr. Casey. The Casey estate was across the street, and they weren't able to pay him back, so Mr. Casey had taken the property back in receivership. Mr. Casey was also very generous to the city, where he had donated his peach orchard to the city to build, at the time, the Northwest Elementary School, which later became the General Douglas MacArthur School, which was across the street from our farm stand. The property that my parents got from Mr. Casey was predominantly an apple and peach orchard, which I don't think a lot of people realize Waltham did have quite a number of orchards, and as Reed had mentioned earlier, that it came to a time where it just wasn't feasible to continue to grow apples and peaches, so my grandfather eliminated about 3/4 of the orchard and got more into growing lettuces and tomatoes and cucumbers and squash and strawberries, and he realized he needed more irrigation, and there was a stream that came over from Hardy Pond, so he found a couple of youngsters at the high school that were out getting into the excavation business, and that was Tony and Louis Antico. Yeah. And they dug some ponds for him, and they still tell me that when I see them at Dunkin' Donuts. So from the early 30s through the 60s, we were predominantly known as a truck farm. whereas all the agriculture that is grown is trucked into the produce market, which at the time was Faneuil Hall, Quincy Market. And then in the early 60s, my grandparents decided to build a farm stand. So it was a true open air market that was open from roughly April through November with the variable crops that were in. We have an enormous refrigerator at the store, but nobody can quite figure out why it's so big. And it was for apple storage at the time. It's almost 25 feet by 25 feet. So it serves a good purpose now, but it's quite large. Over time, our store has evolved from being 100% produce to adding a deli and a bakery, and most notably an ice cream shop, which is hard to believe it's already been 20 years for that.
Wow.
Interestingly enough, my grandmother and Rita's father were cousins. And my grandfather on my mother's side was a foreman for the Valenti farm in Newton. I kind of got it on both ends. Any questions?
Do you know where they came from, the towns and everything?
The same town as Rita's parents and grandparents, Maranda, Italy.
Or Filipino.
Maranda.
On the mainland.
Okay, right.
Yeah, when did you sell the big parcel of land for the condos? What year was that?
That was mid-'80s. At that particular time, if everyone recalls, industry was great. It was very difficult to find people to work on a farm, which a lot of people ask me today, like, do you miss the farm? I go, absolutely, but we would never find kids today that would want to work. 3 seconds in, they'd be complaining about heat stroke or something. So it's a different world that we live in now.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I remember like being on a school bus and riding by the farm, and then like one day, it wasn't there anymore.
I seem to remember your grandmother working until she was very late in life. How old was she still working on the farm?
86.
Yeah, God bless him.
86.
86?
Yep.
Started stock.
Absolutely.
Ricky Farm Stand.
Well, I just found out today, I didn't realize it. It's the exact same name as Rita's grandmother, Angela D'Agostino.
Quarter mile from me.
Rick, did you ever work on the farm?
Yes. Especially this time of year, I remember like my chore getting home from school was to water 10,000 mums.
So do you miss that at all?
I do.
Yeah, yeah. So, sometimes when you get your hands in the dirt or it's soothing.
Exactly. They're very therapeutic.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Therese Ritchie. I grew up on Ritchie Farm, which was located at 656 Trapella Road in Waltham. The Ricky name goes back to 1394 in a part of Italy called Asti. The name means curly hair, which was a physical characteristic of many of the Rickies. There are also many farms in the same area. My grandfather was Constancio James Ritchie. James was born in Catamatica in 1893. We thought he was actually born on December 8, 1893. He was applying for Social Security. We found out his real birthday was May 8. Lucky guy got to celebrate his birthday twice a year. There was probably confusion of his birthday because they lived high in the mountains in Italy, and it took a long time for them to register him because it was half a season in May. You can't leave the farm. So the lucky guy got 2 birthdays, which was awesome. He grew up in a family of 1 sister and 6 brothers. They had a farm, they raised cattle and sheep, and they also grew olives, figs, vegetables. Several of his siblings stayed in Italy, but several more went to Canada and stayed with us. He came to America in 1912 and worked in Utah on the railroads, and then he also worked in the mountains blasting for gold. Realizing that this was dangerous conditions, he decided to come back to Massachusetts in 1915. He had family in Needham, and he had 2 brothers in Lexington who had a farm on Waltham Street, Ricky Brothers. He also worked in Watertown at the old Hood rubber plant. That's going back quite a ways. His wife was Julia English, who was born in July 28, 1897, in Monica also. They knew each other when they were in Italy, but then they came over here, they met again, and they got married in August of 1915. They did live in Watertown for a little while. Then in 1928, they decided to move to Waltham to rent a bigger house. This house was located on Trapella Road. Eventually, they bought the additional 36 lots, which were in the back, which was about 6 acres of land at that time, where they grew all the vegetables. Then, eventually, they purchased an additional 9 lots that were surrounding the house. Eventually, the stand, the greenhouse, the barn, the chicken coop, and the wash house were all built on that property. They had 5 daughters and 2 sons. All their children worked on the farm growing vegetables. They would take the vegetables to the Haymarket Square in Boston, where the vegetables were sold. My grandfather hated vehicles, so he took his in by horse and buggy. And then eventually, when my father Franny and my Uncle Jesse got old enough, they drove a truck, so they would take the vegetables in. Grandfather would say to them, whatever vegetables you don't sell, you gotta give to the poor, which I found kind of ironic, because he was a poor farmer. But they always gave, they always contributed to the community. My grandfather disliked tractors and trucks so much that he never drove. He farmed the land with horse and plow until he was well in his 80s. He just hated equipment. So in 1951, they started growing asters. The first year, they made a whopping $84 and sale the flowers. So they decided to build a farm stand. The farm stand was probably about the size of a 1-car garage. There, they started selling the vegetables and the flowers that they grew. Then they built the chicken coop. And they purchased chickens, which led to selling the eggs and the chickens. In the winter, when the farm stand was closed, but the chickens were still laying eggs, we would sell the chickens out of our kitchen. So many dinners were disrupted by customers coming to the living room kitchen and purchasing eggs, but it always ended up being a social hour. It was always a fun time. In the winter, they would start preparing the 5 greenhouses that were located in the back for flowers. By February, the planting would start along with many disruptive sleeps. The reason being is when the greenhouses got too cold, there was an alarm that went off right under all our bedrooms. That somebody, whether it was my father, my brothers, or my uncles, had to go down and check out what was going on at the greenhouses. So needless to say, many sleepless nights. Eventually, they replaced the small stand with a bigger one in 1960. As the farm grew, so did what they sold. They started selling fruits, bread, milk, newspapers, shrubs, which were actually grown right across the street from the farm stand. And eventually, my parents, Fran and Ella Rickey, built a house there in 1981. In 1983, they remodeled the stand and added a small greenhouse to the farm stand. As the farm grew, so did the family. There were many cousins that lived on the farm, or right next door, or maybe 5 minutes away. Most Sundays, we all gathered at the farmhouse where my grandparents lived for Sunday dinners, holidays, and birthday celebrations. It was great. There were so many kids around, it was unbelievable. So many cousins close by. We went to school together, played together, and then we would start working together in the stand or in the fields. In the spring, the Easter Bunny would make her appearance for many years. The kids would love visiting with the Easter Bunny. In September and October, there were contests to guess the weight of the biggest pumpkin that was on display. At Thanksgiving, they sold fresh turkeys and pies. Then in December, Christmas trees and wreaths. Not only did they farm the land on Trapella Road, but they also farmed the Randos and Mazzano's land on Forest Street. Corn was grown on Trapella Road behind the existing fire station. We also farmed land in Wayland and Weston that was owned by the Doty family, which owned all the Doty Street area between Trapella Road and Forest Street. Behind the stand, there were 5 large greenhouses. These were the flowers and vegetables were started in the wintertime and then eventually transplanted to pots to be sold or plants to go into the fields to be grown. Almost every family member worked on the farm. It was given, you had to. There's no choice. Eventually, some would go off to college, get married, move away, or go on to other jobs. Many neighbors would come up to purchase their flowers, fruits, vegetables, who became close friends to the family. Many neighbors also worked on the fields and at the stand. Some because they were stealing fruits and vegetables, so my grandfather and my father and uncle made them work the fields. Hey, you know, that was punishment. In 1889, the house lots were sold and developed. My father and brother continued to run the stand until 1998, when the rest of the lots were sold to build houses. I still to this day hear of many people come up to me and say, oh my God, we miss the farm so much, we're so friendly. There's always a story of their memories of the farm. As a family, we do still have our family reunions every year, or we try to. Many of my closest friends are also my cousins. A lot of my cousins have that farmer gene still in them, growing the fruits and the vegetables and flowers. My brother Steve grows the biggest tomato plants. You can get lost in them. His daughter Julie grows all kinds of different fruits and vegetables. My brother Billy has a big garden in New Hampshire. My cousin Jimmy Ricky has a big garden in New Hampshire also. Gail in Maine does a lot with flowers. My son does a lot with flowers. And then my daughter this year, she rented land at Codman Farm. She planted 5 zucchini plants and got 111 zucchini. So she did much better than me. I grew 4 plants, 4 zucchinis I got. The other 4, the animals got. So she did great. Times have very much changed since the family started the farm. There are fewer farms in the area, many more houses, apartments, businesses, and less open space. But thanks to the many people who care about the past and the way of life back then, we're trying to bring back more open space and preserve some of the history of our community. And these are some of this actually is, I used to help collect the eggs. I would weigh them, and then we would collect them and then bring them down cellar and weigh them. I actually still use this in my garden, but it's usually just old plants. And here's one of the original bags from the farm stand. We always sold lots of apples. And there's a little book about Haymarket Square, because that's where we always brought our stuff. And then there's all different kind of pictures here of my grandfather's family, my aunts and uncles. Here's a picture of my grandfather in front of the first farmhouse, greenhouse, which then became a storage shed for the sashes. Remember the sashes? And here's my grandfather working on the farm. Just couldn't get the hang of that tractor. And then this is a picture of the farm stand, the farmhouse that I actually grew up in. The wash house where all the fruits and vegetables were prepared for market or for selling. There's my grandfather and my father, Fran, and my uncle Jesse, which many people know them both. And then here's some pictures of the Easter Bunny and kids that came to visit the Easter Bunny and some of my cousins that I actually grew up with. Anybody have any questions? No? Well, thank you very